Hi again, everyone. This is Mark Movsesian. I'm the co-director of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's. I'm joined again by my friend and co-director of the center, Mark DiGirolami, for another episode of Legal Spirits, our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. This is our first episode of the new year, the new academic year, and we're delighted to have with us today Tom Berg. Now, normally, Tom, we talk about the Supreme Court and the upcoming cases. So you're taking the place of the Supreme Court today. So I hope you feel honored by that.
Wow.
So
I sometimes feel like I have 9 different personalities, so maybe that's
okay, well
what's going on.
we will try to get through all of those personalities today, I guess. So we are joined by Tom Berg, who teaches con law, religious liberty, and intellectual property courses, as well as the Religious Liberty Appellate Clinic at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. In the clinic, he supervises students who write briefs in major religious liberty cases. Tom combines his advocacy in the Religious Liberty Appellate Clinic with scholarship. He's one of the nation's leading experts on religious liberty and law and religion. He's the author of 6 books, including a leading casebook called Religion and the Constitution, which he's written with Mike McConnell and Christopher Lund. And actually, both Mark and I have used that book in our law and religion classes here at St. John's. And Tom has been a friend of the center from the beginning. He's been a participant in symposiums that we've hosted on comparative law and religion in Rome. I think Tom was one. I remember we hosted you at. And he's also been a participant in our tradition project. But he's here today to talk about none of those things particularly, but rather about his really interesting new book, Religious Liberty in a Polarized Age, which was just published recently from Eerdmans. So welcome, Tom. Glad to have you with us.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for joining us, Tom. It's great to have you.
Well, Tom, let's get right into the questions about your book. I think it's fair to say, when I read your book anyway, the message I got from it was that the book is about the bitterness of our political polarization and how religious liberty disputes arise from that polarization, but also contribute to that polarization. And yet you say that religious liberty has the potential to calm things down. So, what's your argument in a nutshell? How can religious liberty tamp down the bitter partisan feelings that we observe all around us?
So it's essentially an argument that religious liberty has played that role in the past, and in fact, this is the historical origin, or at least one of the key historical origins of religious liberty in the West, in Europe and America. Uh, Historically, coercive impositions on people's religious practices, they're living out their religious beliefs, cause suffering. Because people adhere to those practices, they stick with them in the face of coercion. At the extreme, they become martyrs, uh, and they suffer as a result. And that suffering and the prospect of suffering creates fear and creates anger among the folks who are subject to it or may be subject to it. And then it also tends to, when they have some possibility of power, to produce retaliation, to generate retaliation or anticipatory retaliation against the other side. I got to get them before they get me. This is what happened in the cycle of religious wars in Reformation era Europe. Particularly in England, where it's Catholics and Protestants. Well, then eventually among the Anglicans, but Catholics and Protestants particularly, right? It's um, uh, going after dissenters under Henry VIII, and then when Henry VIII switches, then we go after Catholics. Thomas More becomes a martyr to conscience, but of course Thomas More, before he was a martyr to conscience, helped in the coercion and killing of Protestants, and then the cycle continued on throughout English history, right? So religious liberty was at least significantly the solution to that cycle. That's what Madison says in the Memorial and Remonstrance. Torrents of blood have been spilt in the old world uh, by the attempts of the secular arm to suppress difference in religious opinions. Religious liberty was the cure. It doesn't eliminate religious differences, nor should it, nor can it. but it takes the government out of them and thereby eradicates their harmful effects on the body politic. So I think we're in a soft version of that problem today, of that cycle. Conservative Christians fear the impositions that are coming on them and have already come on them from progressive laws, and therefore they say things like liberalism simply can't work. It's not possible to have a liberal society, at least as liberalism has developed. We must win the Titanic fight. We must finally prevail. Um, Muslims have become a symbol of that to many conservatives, or too many evangelicals at least. Muslims have become a symbol of that loss of cultural security in the United States, and therefore we've seen efforts against Muslims among evangelicals. Progressives then reply to this, of course, that you're intolerant. This just confirms the intolerance that we already knew that started us after you in the first place, and therefore we have to double down. And therefore, because progressives are going to double down, religious conservatives have to double down on stopping the progressives or stopping LGBTQ rights and so on. And you have the cycle. Protection will reduce that fear. It has that effect. Protection of religious liberty is only presumptive, of course. There are limits on it, but if there's strong protection, it can reduce that fear. But it also has to have two other features that I say. It has to extend to all faiths, at least the presumption of significant protection for your religious practices has to extend to all faiths. And number two, it has to take account of other important interests, and ones that I talk about particularly are LGBTQ rights. That
You know,
means, sorry, I
sure.
yeah, I just quite. That means some boundaries on religious exemptions, as there must be. It also means, and at various places in the book, I argue for this, for both anti-discrimination protections, enactment of laws with significant religious exemptions.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but as you were talking, so it seems, I guess it's fair to say that your argument in favor of religious liberty is really a pretty pragmatic one, right? Which is this is the way to calm things down. And I did recognize definitely it came from Madison's memorial and remonstrance, but is it fair to say that your argument it's more rooted in pragmatism and social peace than it is in, I don't know, identity issues or metaphysical issues or libertarian issues? Is that fair to say?
Well, there's three arguments in the middle of the book for strong religious freedom, and the first one I would say is a personal identity argument, the importance of religion in the believer's life, and I try to make an analogy to the importance of relationships for same-sex partners in an effort to try to create sympathy across these ideological lines. But I do very much think that there is a strong argument based on personal identity for religious freedom. So it's not that that's not in the book. I also am not just saying we should do whatever will reduce division, whatever will create social peace, whatever that is, because that could lead to, suppressing people. Maybe on the whole, it would be better to suppress in many places that would like be an easier thing to tell the conservative Christians in Massachusetts or whatever to just go away and keep quiet. So it's not simply social peace. It rather goes back to the connection between these two. That there is a very important deep human impulse here to seek ultimate truth, to seek a relationship with the divine. That is a central part of human identity. It has been, it always will be. People suffer when they're prevented from doing that. And that suffering then leads on to the cycles that cause social problems as well.
So, Tom, maybe I could just ask on the question of identity. It can't possibly be true that all identities are captured by this argument, because all identities that's just sort of too big, right? If all identities could not possibly be encompassed within the kind of sort of arrangement of peace and negotiation in this way. So, what is it about religious identity and the one that you make the most direct connection to is LGBTQ plus identity that in your view makes these most A, similar, and B, um, how to put it, worth protecting by comparison with, let's say, other identities. What's the way in which these two have such special salience and similarity that you kind of put them at the center of the book as each equally worth protecting?
Yeah. So let's start off with religion. The a modern definition of religion that tries to expand religion beyond the concept of theism uh, was done by Judge Arlen Adams in a couple of cases, including one involving John Africa, the prisoner in the man in Philadelphia who had a vegetarian diet in a prison. The question was, did he have a religious claim to receive vegetarian foods? And the definition there that Judge Adams used was that religion is about ultimate matters and is comprehensive in its focus. And so we're dealing uh, with thought about the ultimate meaning of life, about the divine, about the force, the person, the entity that created us, that created the world, that sustains, or that is, the sort of the ultimate uh, meaning. And also, religion tends to be, because of that, comprehensive in its nature. Um, as I write in the book, and others have said this, there really is no other institution like religion that does all the different things in the serious believer's life. And for religious exemptions, we are usually talking about serious believers, people who are serious enough that they're willing to take the risk of challenging the law in order, and not just going along with it. Um, but the raising of children, the receiving of moral guidance from a leader, the inspiration, service, weekly service, or maybe more often than that. The number of things that are combined in the in as a a as a categorical matter, not in every case, but the number of things that are combined in a religion as in the category is quite unusual. Uh, and that gives rise, I think, to an argument that the kind of suffering that the religious believer uh, experiences is likely to be particularly sharp. We are talking about the loss of the ability to live in harmony with, or according to the commands of, whichever way you want to put it, the ultimate. And we're talking about something that affects the believer throughout their lives. Being unable to follow your faith in one way is not just an isolated thing, it is a part of a web of things that order your life. Well, the other right that I talk about, same sex marriage and same sex couples, is not exactly the same, but certainly the marriage relationship and the partner relationship is pervasive in one's life. The ability to live uh, together with, raise a family with, care for, um, meet and present oneself in society with a partner is a pervasive aspect of people's lives. And I think we've seen from experience that both of these rights and both of these practices, religion and same sex relationships, have proved to be very powerful in people's lives and persistent.
So, Tom, I want to, if I can, follow up with something you just said a second ago about the definition of religion. You were talking about Judge Adams' definition, the kind of analogical definition, and you talked about comprehensiveness and sort of depth or intensity of belief. But there's another factor too, that Adams talked about, and also Kent Greenewalt spoke about. He kind of channeled Judge Adams in the legal academy here, and that is a kind of institutional religion or group religion. So I want to talk a little bit about this. Is one of my hobby horses, as Mark knows. I write a lot about this. You argue in your book that there are good reasons to extend protections for religion to as wide a range of deeply held moral views as possible. You say atheism, agnosticism should be covered. But how about the kind of non institutional, idiosyncratic religion? I'm talking here, of course, about the rise of the nuns. These are people who, many people in America today, I think like 60 million people, say that they don't have a formal religious identity, but they nonetheless have deep spiritual beliefs. We saw in a number of the COVID cases, some of these people were seeking religious exemptions, and courts, by and large, were willing to treat these people as exercising a religion, but there was some question about that. And I wonder, first of all, do you think I'm right? This is going to be a problem going forward with so many nuns in America. And if it's a problem, would nuns also, with these idiosyncratic beliefs, be within your definition of religion meriting free exercise protection as well?
So yes, to the extent the idiosyncratic belief is a sort of meets the test of ultimacy and comprehensiveness, I think we have to extend the same. We have to call it a religion. We should call it a religion, um, and it will be interesting to see how often those kinds of claims come up. Uh, you're right that they have, and they will, and the more people there are following idiosyncratic spiritual beliefs, the more they will. There's there's a less of a tendency, I think, for a more fluid kind of belief to generate the sort of strong reaction or strong moral duties or strong moral imperatives. I don't want to use commands or religious requirements, because that might suggest only certain theological views, but to generate the kind of strong moral imperative that would cut against a law. But we'll see how often that happens. It'll also be interesting to see how much the nuns, NONES, develop institutions. Right? I think that, for example, the atheist churches are quite interesting, that formed a few years ago. I don't know that any of them are still going. It to some extent was a failed effort, but to try to create the kind of features of institutional religion in these more individualistic forms, I imagine that will happen more and more.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because Mark knows I've actually written about this. I have a relative, my great granduncle, who started one of these atheist churches in the late 19th century, and it didn't last past him.
Yeah.
They kind of merged into the Unitarians, but
So
it's
what was that group?
it was he called it, I forget the name, it was in Chicago, the Rationalist Society of
Yeah.
Chicago, something like that. He had thousands of people at one point who were following him, but over time found it just very difficult to keep it up, and as I say, eventually merged into the Unitarian Universalists. But
Sure.
just to finish with the nuns, I mean, Stephen Collis at University of Texas, he and I have debated this. He agrees with you. He thinks that actually nuns are unlikely to generate the kind of strong convictions that will require them to dissent from civil law. We'll see, we'll see. But I know Mark has some questions too. I
Actually,
want to give it to
actually,
Mark.
and I'm with Mark on this question, and don't find atheist churches interesting. I find them depressing and scary, and suggestive of the problems maybe with an approach like yours, a very generous and liberal in the sort of classical sense of approach. But I guess maybe the point at which my question arises on is on the issue of exemption, which has really ballooned. It's the number of requests for exemptions that we've seen, particularly in the COVID and post COVID period, but not only those for a variety of other claimants, has really exploded. And so you have a very broad understanding of religion, right? With a sort of the ultimate is what you saw as a sort of a semi-functionalist kind of understanding of those concerns that go to ultimate matters. Well, that's going to really be quite various with respect to the sorts of things that people think are of ultimate importance, or of ultimately true, or that ultimately matter for them. Um, and you often argue in the language of religious liberty for all, which is actually, in the new piece that I'm writing, one of my hobby horses. I think that that is an unsustainable principle, at least if it means um, religious exemption for all from general law, right? And so I guess the question is, we've talked a little bit about minority groups and individuals, but when you were talking about COVID restrictions in the book, you also say that judges should have subjected those claims of exemption, at least maybe you sort of draw a distinction between vaccination maybe requirements and other kinds of requirements, but let's just take COVID restrictions to special scrutiny. And you go so far as to say that many claims of religious exemption probably aren't religiously motivated at all. But then you sort of get back into the question, well, but if you're defining religion in this very, very broad way, how can you say that? So, how can you reconcile your extremely broad commitment to religious exemption as religious liberty for all with skepticism about the grounds on which those who increasingly seek exemptions in our day and age, especially in the COVID era, from things like vaccination, masking, and other COVID requirements? So you say a lot about drawing distinctions, but again, those distinctions are going to circle back to the question that Mark asked you at the beginning. They're going to make the problems of polarization worse when judges draw them and say, actually, you're not a religion. That's not a religious, right? Isn't that sort of going to come back to bite the thesis on its butt, on its behind, right? What do you think about all that, Tom?
Yeah, great question. So let me start off. I mean, religious liberty for all is a slogan, uh, right? It's not a thesis. In fact, I have occasionally committed tweets, and those tweets have occasionally contained hashtag religious liberty for all. I
They're not
confess to
called
this.
tweets anymore,
I
Tom.
don't know what they're called. What are they called now on
They
X?
don't have a name, but we can go with tweets for the moment.
Um, yeah. So at any rate, that's clearly a slogan. What it's meant to communicate is that a presumptive right to act on one's faith, right, it should be extended to the whole range of faiths, you know, setting with the definitional limit question there that we've been talking about. It is a presumption. It's not an absolute, right? Historically, we have in state in the historic founding era state constitutions and other documents phrases like the peace and safety of the state, public peace, public order, maybe substantial threats to public order. The Supreme Court has said things like that. Private rights, and in some cases, uh, and so that's to use another constitutional phrase. That's ordered liberty. The challenge then is to take that concept and apply it to a world in which there's much more government regulation, and so that it can't be that whatever the government says uh, is a private right or is a matter of public order. Uh, that's enough to defeat it, unless we're essentially going to admit that the modern state should dramatically restrict the scope of free exercise of religion.
But
Uh,
wait, Tom. But isn't the problem not just greater government regulation? It's greater government regulation in the context of explosive pluralism of a kind that Madison,
yeah,
when Madison was writing, he could not have conceived of a situation in which we've got no nothing like the
Yeah.
kind of unity of society, of cultural mores and so on that they had. So isn't that also what's going on?
No, you are right about that. That increases the number of challenges and maybe the complexity of doing the exemptions analysis. It also means that there are many more cases in which the law is going to come in conflict with religious beliefs. So, which it's a bigger problem. It means there will be more suffering if there aren't exemptions, and it'll mean there will be more challenges on courts about drawing the lines for exemptions. I would still say that it's worth doing. We have a lot of tools for assessing the effect of a religious practice on society and on others, and the book tries to go through them. So as to the COVID vaccination cases, there are certainly cases of unquestionable sincere religious motivation by people who believe in that the derivation from fetal cell lines, Catholic beliefs, etc. But we also have reason to question a lot of the claims here. We have real evidence here that a lot of the claims, it's not that they're not sincere, it's not that they're not deeply felt, it's that they're not religious. They're coming from an objection to vaccines in general, or the kind of the political objections to in the COVID context, and we know that because of the vast number of uh, online a large number of online forums offering sort of boilerplate objections. If you want to these people are saying online, if you want to object to a vaccine, here's a thing that you can download, and it's just boilerplate language in a context where this is highly politicized. So we've got good reason to think that a lot of them are not truly religious. That I think at least activates two things. One is there are reasons to give the government more scope, or maybe a private employer, if it's that context, more scope to question sincerity. In general, we don't question sincerity in religious exemption claims. It's really hard to do. Nathan Chapman, however, has made an argument that we ought to be questioning sincerity more often as part of we need to be able to do that in order to strike any kind of balance, sort of responding to some of the concerns that you have, Mark. Um, I don't know whether we can, double down on insincerity in general, but certainly in this case, there's a reason to give the government a bit more room to question sincerity. And then the second thing is, if there are going to be a lot of claims that are not religiously driven, then that does increase the government's interest, right? If a lot of people are going to do this, if it's not a small group, as you often have a small group of religious believers, it's not like that here, then that's going to increase the government's interest uh, in regulating, because it'll increase the spread of the disease. Um, so I think one of those two things is justifiable in the vaccination cases, either closer attention to sincerity, or else at least factoring in the number of claims, the likely number of claims, into the compelling interest analysis. And just really briefly, this idea that if there would be a lot of claims, that's a reason to deny exemption, is not a new sort of thing, that I've come up with for this case. A long standing reason why we don't have a lot of tax exemptions specifically for religion is the concern about self-interest and encouraging and incentivizing people to couch their claims as religious. We do have some religious tax exemptions, like the church exemptions in the IRS code, but they're limited, and in that case, the IRS gets a lot of room to decide what's a church. And I think that same dynamic could be said to be operating in the vaccine cases. Now, are these perfect lines? No. I just would only say, make the kind of Winston Churchill point. A regime of exemptions under judicial management is the worst system there is, except for all the others. In a polarized society, legislators in red states and blue states are just not going to reach um, unpolarizing results, balanced results, without some sort of push from the courts towards or either towards accommodation in this case.
All right. Well, so that answer provoked many, many other questions from me, but for the sake of time, I want to ask you one last one, because this is one that kind of frames the more general or broader philosophical perspective from which the book is coming. And both at the beginning and at the end of the book, you discuss the importance of adopting what you call an ironic perspective or point of view in engaging with these conflicts, right? The conflicts of religious freedom. And for me, it was a pleasure to see this, because you and I, in the past, on Mirror of Justice, on the blog to which we both contribute and have contributed now for, it's been now about 10 years, maybe more, for you, or maybe more for me. But we see this issue maybe a little bit differently, and so maybe you can just explain to listeners what an ironic perspective or point of view means in this context, and how you intend it as a kind of maybe framing or perspectival mechanism for the book.
Yes. So I did a little bit on this in the book, in the conclusion, and I'm looking forward to doing more about this in an article that I'm coming out with in Wayne State Law Review. That's going to directly engage the things that you and I have discussed before in your great book on the tragedy of religious freedom, right? And uh, that's the juxtaposition here that we've argued about, is an ironic versus a tragic approach to difficult issues. So what do I mean by the ironic approach? It does not mean David Letterman's sort of snark, like throwing a TV off the top of a building and kind of just guffawing about it because nothing really matters anyway, so we're just all kind of ironic. Um, I'm appealing to the use of irony by Reinhold Niebuhr in the book from the early 1950s called The Irony of American History. And that book, which was very influential at the time and remains influential among a range of thinkers, argued that that American history could be understood, and particularly the sort of the meaning of the Cold War could be understood with the perspective of irony. And irony here means that uh, there are um, there are virtues, there are vices, there is good, there is evil, and those things should be identified. But all of us have a tendency, even in the necessary task of identifying good and virtue as against evil and vice, to overstate the case, to overstate our own virtue, to overstate the vice or understate the virtue of those on the other side. And we can fall into real problems by doing that. We will find, for example, that the things we say about our opponent apply to us as well. That was Niebuhr's warning to the United States in the Cold War. They had to fight Soviet communism. It was a threat, a serious threat, but America had to watch out that it didn't display the same vices that it was complaining about, and rightly complaining about. So one example is communism is dangerous because the assertion was, and I believe it, because it asserted that it had the answer to history. That if you identified and identified with the interests of the proletariat, you would find the key to history, and we would reach a utopia, or at least a significantly better society. Americans criticized that, but they had their own, Niebuhr said, their own form uh, of sort of utopian thinking of their own. We've understood the key to history. What is it? It's freedom. It's liberty. That's what we have in the United States, and we are the source of that, and that could lead us into the same kind of arrogance. Uh, uh, Again, maybe not at the same level, but a dangerous kind of arrogance. Well, I see the same thing going on here in our debates today. For example, I think that when conservative Christians make arguments against Islam in an effort to restrict Muslims' freedom or equality, it's ironic that much of what they say is applied back on them. Right? They say Islam is not. Pat Robertson, when he was alive, said Islam is not a religion; it's a political movement trying to take away your rights. Well, how often have we heard that about conservative Christians? And it's unfair in both cases. Uh, uh, you can have your religion, Muslims, but don't bring it out here in front of the rest of us. Don't wear um, the veil. Don't arbitrate your business disputes according to Sharia law, which is a dangerous thing. Well, Christians, keep your beliefs to yourself too. Same thing. I think that because of I think the same sort of ironies apply in the attacks on between same-sex couples and religious objectors, because there are parallels between the two groups. When religious conservatives say we're not going after orientation, we're only going after conduct, or we're not going after private conduct, we're only denying civil marriage. Those same kinds of distinctions are used against religious believers. You can believe whatever you want, just don't act on it. You can believe it in your church, you can believe it in your home, just don't bring it into the workplace or into your foster care services. And both sides make these sort of statements about the other with no apparent sense of irony about what it would say about their own claims. What this approach presumes is that there is virtue and vice. This is not both sidesism, and it's not necessarily saying that the two sides are equal. And by the way, I don't generally say that the religious right is worse than progressives on this. I think it's a very complicated question. Who's more responsible for polarization in general? On religious liberty, progressives are equally or more responsible. But the ironic point of view is not that there's no difference, not that there's not relative differences in virtues and vices. It just says, um, beware when you push your virtue too far. We all tend to do that. I think it's different from a tragic vision, which tends to say, and Mark, you can correct me on this, that that there's really not sort of any common metric that the groups can be talking about here. There's not a thing, an overarching thing that you can appeal to say, oh, well, you're saying this, but you're not giving it to them. You're not following the common metric. Um, I think that civil rights protections and civil liberties protections are by nature general, and therefore there is at least some room to make those sorts of arguments.
So these are really very interesting topics. I wish we could go on longer. We can't. I will say one thing, Tom, as you're speaking, it occurs to me that an ironic perspective requires a kind of detachment from the situation and to be able to look at yourself, right? You have to be able to look from outside onto yourself. And I just think we have really lost that. A lot of that right now. The idea of self-criticism, I think maybe it's always hard for humans to do that, but I think especially now when we are in our two camps, it's extremely hard to look at your own contribution to this. Anyway, I wish we could go on longer. We just can't. So I want to say thank you, Tom, for joining us this afternoon. It's been great having you with us. Mark, you want to say anything
Yes,
last words?
absolutely. Of course. Thank you so much, Tom. This was wonderful, and congratulations again on the book. It's very interesting, listeners. You ought to get yourself a copy. It's a religious liberty or religious freedom in a polarized age, right?
Right.
Um,
Available from
That is
Eerdmans
right.
on Amazon and a bookstore near you. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. For listeners, this is Mark Movsesian and Mark DiGirolami from the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's with another episode of Legal Spirits. You can find past episodes archived on all kinds of streaming platforms: Spotify, Apple, iTunes, Android, and also on our website, lawandreligionforum.org. That's it for this episode. See you next time.